Well, who's looking forward to watching the vice presidential debate tonight, which I'm sure is going to be a lot better than the circus we saw last Tuesday with Joe Biden and Donald Trump? My guess is tonight there's going to be fewer interruptions. I can't imagine Mike Pence, who's like a robot, challenging Kamala too much or interrupting her or, being just a general bully. I don't see that happening. And I, if anything, Kamala would maybe be the one who's going to be a little bit more of a bully, but I think she's probably going to keep her cool tonight during the debate. So I'm excited to watch it. Maybe by the time you're watching this, the debate's happening or already happened. One debate I listened to yesterday was Adam Schiff, who is being, he's the guy who leads Russiagate and the witch hunt against Trump all the time. He is being challenged by this Republican, Eric Early. Adam Schiff is likely not going to lose that election. He's likely going to be reelected. But nonetheless, there was a debate between Adam Schiff and his Republican challenger, Eric Early, yesterday. It was hosted by the League of Women Voters, which historically debates had been hosted by the League of Women Voters, but then it switched over to to the big networks. And it was done on Zoom. And so I was listening. I don't know if there was a video of it, but I was listening to it. And it was the best debate that I had listened to. Because, for one, the moderator was very neutral. I have no idea which way she leans, whether she's Republican or Democrat. She did not indicate one way or the other. Her questions were neutral in tone. The way she posed the questions were extremely neutral. The questions themselves were very neutral. So there was no way to know which way the moderator actually leaned. Also, because it was on Zoom, they were able to keep everybody muted. So Adam Schiff, when it was not his turn, he was muted. And when it wasn't Eric Early's turn, he was muted. And when their time ran out, they were cut off. And you could hear it mid-sentence. They were just bloop. And she would and not even apologize for cutting them off. She would just move on to the next question like nothing happened. And it was great because we could actually hear policy. We could actually hear what one side versus the other has to say about various different topics. There were no interruptions whatsoever because they were muted the entire time. It wasn't their turn. It was just really, really great. Now, I know a lot of people wonder why we're not doing that with the presidential debates or the vice presidential debates or even the primaries. And the answer is easy. It's because networks want to make money. They want the drama. They want you to feel frustrated. They want you to get angry. They want you to look forward to the next debate because they know that if they can create a reality show style drama, you're going to tune into it. So they don't have any interest in actually furthering American democracy or actually aiding in our political process. They instead have an invested interest in keeping the drama high, in keeping the frustration levels high, in keeping people at each other's throats. It is in their invested interest, these big media companies, these mainstream establishment media companies, it is in their best interest to make money and for us to all lose as the American people. They are an enemy to the American people. The press has become an enemy to the American people. Donald Trump actually was the one who was originally pointing that out. When he first started attacking the press, when he was first elected, I was one of those people that was very shocked. I was very like, oh my gosh, he's attacking the press. This is what dictators do. This is terrible. I was very much against that. But then as time went on, I realized, actually, the guy's kind of right. The press is an enemy to the American people. They lie all the time, and they're not on your side. They're not trying to help you. There's this misnomer, especially amongst the left, like CNN and MSNBC and New York Times and Washington Post, like they're the good guys. They're trying to further democracy. They're here to help us. They are not. They are here to make money, and that's it. They want to take your money. They don't even care about what you think politically or what's happening politically. They're just here to make a boatload of cash. And it's obvious when we're watching these debates. They're trying to keep it as contentious as possible. So we'll see what happens tonight. Interested in watching that. Now, regarding the debate last Tuesday between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, I want to pinpoint in on one question that was asked of Joe Biden and his answer. And it's about racial inequality in America. And the reason I want to focus on this is because obviously right now that has been the big talk the big push forward, and really what's fueling even the presidential campaign on the Democratic side, is racial inequality in America. And we've seen for months now people taking to the streets, protests, marches, some, most peaceful, some not so peaceful, riots, takeovers of cities like Seattle and Portland. We've seen, obviously, it's the big talk right now. And now, look, people get on my case all the time. And they say, oh, here you go again, Kim. You're going to wipe away the fact that there's racial issues in America, and you're going to become a class reductionist. You're a class reductionist. Yes, I am a class reductionist this day and age in 2020, because I firmly believe that our problems in this country are economic in nature, that everything boils down to money, and that you can sit there and scream all day long about racism or racial inequality in America. But at the end of the day, when you ask for a policy, what policy are you asking for? Let's think about what policy did all of these folks that were marching in the streets ask for when they were doing the Black Lives Matter marches, or saying that there's racial injustice in America, or America's founded on racism and slavery. What was the policy they were asking for? Was it racial in nature? No, it was not. It was economic. They were asking for defund the police. That has nothing to do with race. That has everything to do with money. So then you're saying, oh, well, we need more money in other programs and less money in the police. I agree. But that's not a racial policy. That's an economic policy. So when we look at the inequality in America and what is driving the inequality in America, I think we need to take a scalpel to it and understand what's really going on so that we can actually fix it. If we continue to just go along with these ideas, this idea or that idea, we're never going to fix the problem. We need to understand what the problem actually is, not what it looks like, what it actually is, so we can actually fix it. So I want to just play this clip for you. This is the question. This is the answer. Then we're going to break this down, and I'm going to show you. Now, you might be in the camp of saying, no, Kim, you are wrong. It is racial. We have racism in America. America is the most racist country on earth. You're wrong. It's not about economics. You might be in that camp, but I want you to hear me out. I want you to hear me out. I want you to listen to my argument as to why I'm going to tell you, no, I believe it is economic, it's class, and that's what we need to focus on and fix. Hyper-focus on it. Hyper-focus on it. And the politicians in America don't want you to focus on that because that hurts their donors. Their donors don't want you to make policies that have to do with money. Those donors want you to think it's just racism. Oh, racism, 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 because that means they don't have to do anything. They can all just take a knee. They can wear, some signs. They can say, yes, Black Lives Matter. They can do all of these things and placate you and make you think they're on your side, and meanwhile do absolutely nothing to actually fix the problem. They want you to think it's not economic in nature, because if they have to face the fact it's economic, they have to change. Their donors are not going to like that. So let's go ahead and look at this clip here. This is Joe Biden being asked the question. Here's his response, and we're going to break it down.
Do you believe that there is a separate but unequal system of justice for blacks in this country?
Yes, there is. There's systemic injustice in this country, in education and work, and in law enforcement, and the way in which it's enforced.
Okay, so he cites specifically education, work, and law enforcement, so criminal justice. So let's go ahead and break this down, first starting with the schools. Now, I think most of us know that the schools are not equally funded. Schools receive funding on local, state, and federal levels, and the local funding is often distributed based on property tax. So if you live in a rich neighborhood and your homes are worth a lot of money, they're paying a lot of property tax, and those property taxes go back to the schools, so those schools end up with more money versus poor neighborhoods where their homes are not worth as much. There's not as many taxes, so those schools get fewer funds. So we know that there's that disparity, but it goes deeper than that, actually. The fact is that what the researchers now know is that the inequality in educational outcomes, so how well a student does when the student is in school, is not about the color of their skin, or even if the school is segregated, even if the school is highly segregated, where there's disproportionate number of blacks versus whites in schools. They're finding that it's not about the segregation or the racial makeup of the school. It's about the poverty levels of the school. That is what's going to determine how well the students ultimately end up doing. Now, oftentimes, because of the history of racism, which I agree, the history of racism in this country has led to people of color, by and large, having less money, fewer economic opportunities, fewer economic resources. And because of the racism in the past, which, by the way, even the racism in and of itself and the history of slavery and the history of racism in this country, I believe actually stems from economic. I even think that was economically focused or based, and it wasn't about hate because of somebody's race. For example, when you look at slavery, slavery was not about, oh, I hate black folks, and so therefore I'm going to enslave them and treat them like dogs. That's not why they did slavery. They did slavery for economic reasons. It was economic in nature. It was, I need free labor. I need cheap free labor. We still do that now, by the way, with undocumented immigrants. We say, oh, I need them. I need them because somebody's got to do this job. No one else is going to do the job, so I can pay this guy hardly anything because he's the one willing to do it. So they said, I need free, cheap labor, and so I need slaves. In order to justify their treatment of a human being, they then had to make up stories in their mind as to why they could do that to this man and not the other. So what they would say is, well, because God said you're lesser because of Abel and Cain, or, they make up ridiculous things. Or they say, well, because blacks are not as smart as whites, or because blacks are, they make up, they're whatever the ridiculous narratives they came up with in their mind. They didn't come up with those first. They came up with those after, in order to justify their mistreatment of another human being. So I believe even the racism in this country, even the slavery in this country, was economically based and then turned into hate. It wasn't the hate that fueled the economics. So, yes, there's a history of it. And then you go forward, and now we've got the residual effects of that racism, but it's economic, and the way to fix it is economic. So in this study, this was done by Stanford Graduate School of Education, they were trying to figure out why some students do have poor educational outcomes than others, and they wanted specifically to study segregation in the schools. That's what they were specifically looking for. So they says here, identifying the effects of school segregation. In studying segregation in U.S. schools today, Reardon and colleagues sought to discover whether racial segregation has the same harmful effects that it did 50 years ago, when efforts to integrate Southern school districts began in earnest. What they found was striking. Without exception, the level of segregation correlated not only with the size of the achievement gap, but also with the rate at which that gap grew as students progressed from 3rd to 8th grade. To determine what accounted for the correlation, they controlled for racial differences in school poverty and found that segregation no longer predicted the achievement gaps. That meant the association between racial segregation and the growth of the achievement gaps operated entirely through differences in school poverty. So they looked at schools that had the same amount of segregation. They went into Detroit, Baltimore, and Atlanta, and they looked at schools that were highly segregated. And what they found was that the disparity in how well the kids did had nothing to do with the fact that with the level of segregation of the school, but it had everything to do with how the poverty difference between the income levels of the students in that school versus their counterparts in other schools. And what they found was that the correlation was not the color of skin or even the level of segregation, but that the correlation was poverty on every level. So they said no matter the color of the student's skin, no matter their gender, ethnic makeup, racial makeup, the common denominator all across the lines of a student performing poorly versus students performing better had to do with economics. While racial segregation is important, it's not the race of one's classmates that matter per se, said Reardon. It's the fact that in America today, racial segregation brings with it very unequal concentrations of students in high and low poverty schools. So yes, it might seem on its surface like racism and segregation. The segregation is the byproduct, and the poverty is the driver. So what they're saying is it's the poverty that is actually the determining factor of whether or not the student is going to do well and whether or not their school overall is going to do well. It's the poverty. It's not the racial segregation or the racism. And it just so happens that in this country right now, where we're at, is that poor people, that people of color have fewer economic resources because of that history of racism and because of the lack of economic opportunity, that people of color have fewer economic resources and therefore have fewer, they're poorer, and then their kids do poorer overall because of the poverty. So it's not about the race. So what does that tell you? In order to fix it, it's not like you can just desegregate schools based on race, and that's how you're going to fix it. You instead need to desegregate based on poverty and income, which a lot of times is the same, right? So it's, you've got clusters of neighborhoods and they're all one racial makeup and they're poor versus the other neighborhood, which is another racial makeup and they're not poor. And then when you desegregate based on race, you're actually also desegregating based on poverty. You just don't realize that, right? You're saying, oh, no, it's race-based desegregation, but in reality, it's also income-based desegregation. So then when the outcome is good and you say, well, look, it worked, then you think it's because of racial desegregation. And in reality, it was income desegregation. So it's very important to know what the real problem is so that we can correct that problem. Now, why are poor students why are they performing poorly in schools? That's another question. And a lot of times the schools are equally funded. In some more liberal states, the schools are equally funded. And so they cannot attribute it to less funding or teachers being paid less or fewer resources for the school because the schools are being given the same thing. So a lot of social workers and child psychologists they attribute it to home life. They say that kids that are they have more economic resources. Oftentimes their families have fewer dysfunctions. Maybe the kids are coming from divorced homes, but the child themselves don't have to worry about where they're getting their next meal. The kid doesn't have to worry about whether mom or dad is going to make it to work on time so that they can ensure that they get the paycheck to pay the bills. They don't have to worry about being evicted. They don't have to worry about even mom or dad going to jail. Those types of things put a lot of stress on a student who's poor. And a lot of times, even some of these students, especially as they get a little bit older, they have to pitch in with the bills. So they have to go get a job. They can't focus on their studies. They have to get a part-time job. They got to pitch in and pay the electric bill. That puts a lot of strain on these students, and that is the issue. So what we have to do is make corrections to give these students in these poorer neighborhoods, in these poorer homes, more safety. Now, there's not much we can do if there's abuse, and if they're focused on that. I mean, obviously, we can try to get them out of those situations. Obviously, there's things that can be attempted, but trying to help a student not stress out about eviction or food on the table, I think is easier for us to focus on a policy level if we start focusing on it. But we're not. Instead, we're talking about racism. And to me, that is a huge failure. It's a failure to do that because it's not helpful. You're not helping anybody by doing that. What you need to do is focus on the fact that these students are lacking resources and they're lacking stability. Now, what we know, let's move on to work because this also has to do with school. So the disparities in the workforce. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, actually Asians outperform everybody. So when you look at this, Asian women and men earned more than their white, black, and Hispanic counterparts in 2017. And you can look at this graph here and you can see that Asian men, which is in the orange, Asian women are in the purple, that they outperform everybody respectively. So why is that? Well, Asians come from just as poor neighborhoods and a lot of people have this idea in their mind falsely that the reason why there's less inequality now with Asians is because Asians are coming from China with a lot of money or something. And that's just not true. My family's Vietnamese. The Vietnamese community came on boats mostly and are refugees and had nothing. They escaped Vietnam with absolutely nothing. And that is pretty common amongst a lot of Asians. But the thing about Asians is that so they focus a lot on school. And then there's these studies that say, well, when you look at a black man with a bachelor's degree versus a white man with a bachelor's degree, there's still an economic disparity between the two. And that is true, except that you have to look at where the degree came from. So if you come from a top level school, you're going to get a better job than somebody who's unable to go to that top level school. If you came out of a high school with lower grades because you came from poverty and you had other stressors in your life that didn't allow you to focus on your education, you're not going to get into the best colleges. And if you're not getting into the best colleges, you're not going to get the better jobs. That's the way it works. Now, Asians are proving to us that that it is economic and not racial in nature, because Asians, though they come from the same poor neighborhoods with the same poor schools on the elementary school and high school level, those students go on to the better universities. So the top universities in this country have disproportionately more Asians than any other group. Asians make up less than 6% of the U.S. population. It's like 5.6% or 5.4%. Yet Asians on average make up 20 to 30% of the university populations of the best universities in the country. So when you look at these top universities, here's a list here. Caltech, one of the best universities in the nation, almost 40% Asian. And yet Asians make up less than 6% of the U.S. population. You go down this list here, you've got UC San Diego, UC Irvine, UC Berkeley, UC, so the UC system here in California is a top-notch system. All the schools are ranked in the top 50 universities in the country. And you've got here Asians making up 30 to 40% of those populations, even though Asians are not that much of the U.S. population. So all of these really high-level schools, I mean, even at the Ivy League, Asians make up the second largest group behind whites at the Ivy League level for all the Ivy League schools. So Asians are getting into the top schools, and because they're getting into the top schools, they're getting better jobs, and it's being proven that they're then out-earning their white counterparts. That comes down to what I'm trying to prove there is showing you that it's about the quality of the education that you receive. So it's not just about holding the bachelor's degree in your hand. And you could say, well, this group having a bachelor's versus this group having a bachelor's, this group still doesn't earn as much, so it's racism. Well, you got to look at where the bachelor's is coming from. And Asians are showing, because they prioritize getting into these top schools, their families put a lot of pressure on them. They're getting into these top universities, and then they're graduating from those top universities, and they're outperforming their white counterparts. So that goes to show that, again, it's the economics. Now, Asians also, when we talked about home life for those kids that were struggling in those poor schools, Asians have the lowest divorce rate of every group out there. And kids have the most stable home life within the Asian community, and less stress. And I can tell you, as an Asian myself, that Asian families do not put pressure on their kids to go get jobs and help pitch in. Asian parents put all the focus on education. In fact, Asian kids are often not encouraged at all to make friends or to go out and socialize or to do, go to birthday parties and sleepovers, slumber parties. That doesn't happen really in the Asian community so much. It's a huge focus on studies, huge focus on extracurriculars that are going to help you get that college scholarship. So that focus is, and the stability for the student, where all the stress, their parents take all the stress off of them and say, you just study, and then you're going to go to college. And then you have one of two options. You can either be a doctor or an engineer. Take your pick, but that's what you're going to be. So that goes to show it's economic in nature. In the economics from the just even at the interpersonal level of what a student has to worry about. If they have to worry about money, they're going to perform poorly in school, and that it just at every level it affects them. Now, obviously, the criminal justice system. I just want to hit on this. Now, there are studies that do show. Now, this is where the racism does come into play, and I'm surprised this is not what people are marching on the streets for if they're going to march for something. It's that in sentencing, we do know, based on numerous studies, that sentencing is racist. That if you put two people in front of you who have been convicted of the same crime, and they have the same history, the same background, the same rap sheet, and they come from even the same economics, and you've got a black man or a white man in front of the judges that are doing the sentencing. The black person, criminal, gets a harsher sentence than the white one. That has actually been shown to be true. That is where the racism actually does lie. And there should be something done in order to prevent that from happening. Certain sentencing, that's where it gets difficult, though. We could say, well, mandatory sentencing, but that's a problem, too, because you've got to have mitigating circumstances. But then that's where the racism comes in, because then the mitigating circumstances, you're just white, so it's mitigating. And that's not okay. However, before you even get to the sentencing part, if you are charged with a crime, it is not about black or white. It is about money. It is solely, purely about what kind of economic resources do you have to hire yourself a good attorney? Are you going to be able to get yourself out of this with a high-powered attorney, or are you going to have to rely on a public defender? This is from the Prison Policy Initiative. This is studies that they've done, and their findings are, they said, so they're looking at what is causing certain people to be incarcerated, and we found that incarcerated people in all gender, race, and ethnicity groups earned substantially less prior to their incarceration than their non-incarcerated counterparts of similar ages. So they go through and they find here's black men and incarcerated black men versus non-incarcerated black men, Hispanic men versus non-incarcerated Hispanics, whites to whites. They were comparing apples to apples, and they were saying, look, if you are a black man and you make under 20 grand a year versus a black man who makes over 30,000 a year, your chance of incarceration is much higher just because you're poor. So it's not about being black or white or male or female. It's how much money do you have. The less money you have, the less you're likely not as educated. You probably don't speak as eloquently, and therefore you're not as impressive to a jury, and then they find you guilty. You couldn't get a good lawyer to help you get out of it. All of this stacks up, and it's against you, and that is a huge problem. So they found that the incarceration has more to do with poverty than it does with any other factor. And so, but because people of color tend to be poorer than people, white folks in America, people of color disproportionately make up the prison system. But it's not because it's racist. It's because it's poor. And we know that there's, in poverty areas, we know that there's more crime. There's all of that stuff happens when there's a lack of financial resources. Crime rates go up, stress levels go up. That means police involvement goes up when there's more crime in certain areas. So all of that just stacks up one on top of the other. But ultimately, guys, it comes down to economics. And we need to stay hyper-focused on that so we can make policies, scream for policies that require economic change. But these guys in Washington don't want to make that change because it's going to hurt their donors. We need to stay hyper-focused on this. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. Also, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me, kim@kimiverson.com. Love to hear from you.